right, you guys, welcome back. Let's get through the last half of chapter 23. Before I dive into the next passage, I want to share something about crucifixion. I left off in the last video sharing about, how Jesus was naked through it and he wasn't actually covered, and how just gruesome it was. So I did find something a little extra about crucifixion during that time, and I'm going to read it to you. Crucifixion was universally recognized as the most horrible type of execution. The condemned criminal was scourged and forced to carry the crossbeam to the spot where a stake had already been erected. A tablet stating the crime was often placed around the offender's neck and was fastened to the cross after the execution. The victim was commonly tied or sometimes nailed to the crossbeams with the nails in the wrists, since the bones in the hand could not take the weight. The beam was then raised and fixed to the upright pole. For a particularly slow, agonizing death, they might drive blocks or pins into the stake for a seat or a step to support the feet. Death came about either through loss of blood circulation, followed by coronary failure, or through the collapse of the lungs, causing suffocation. That could take days. So often the victim's legs would be broken below the knees with a club, causing massive shock and eliminating any further possibility of easing pressure on the wrists. This was really awful stuff, you guys. We're starting off in verse 44. It says, "By this time it was about noon, and darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. 3 hours of darkness. I don't know that I really used to pay attention to this verse. I think only in the last year did it finally come to mind that it was like, oh, why would it be dark at noon? Noon is like when the sun is the brightest. And then for 3 hours at that there would be no light. It says the light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn down the middle. Then Jesus shouted, 'Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands.'" So let's talk about that moment, because that's kind of insane. It's very not supposed to happen. There's different accounts from non-Christians in history that record this, and I found something on it. I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Darkness covered the whole land while Jesus was on the cross. This timing is significant because it occurred during Passover, which always takes place at a full moon, meaning a natural solar eclipse would have been astronomically impossible." So Thales, a first century historian, he referenced later by Julius Africanus, reportedly tried to explain the darkness as a solar eclipse. Africanus pushes back, noting that this explanation doesn't work given the Passover timing, ironically affirming that an unusual darkness did occur. Then we have Phlegon of Tralles. He's a Greek historian, so I probably said his name wrong. I'm really sorry. Wrote of an extraordinary darkness and an earthquake during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, dating it to the same general time frame as the crucifixion. These writers were not Christians and had no theological motive to support the gospel narrative, which strengthens the credibility of their observations. In scripture, darkness often symbolizes judgment, mourning, or divine intervention. You can see that in Amos chapter 8, verse 9. In this moment, creation itself seems to respond to the weight of what is happening, the Son of God bearing sin. It is as though the world pauses, marking the gravity of the cross. The literal earth was mourning for this time that he's on the cross. Okay, so it says this wasn't a private spiritual experience or a story written in isolation. The crucifixion and the darkness that accompanied it left an imprint on history, astronomy, and human memory. The gospel writers weren't inventing drama. They were recording something so startling that even secular historians felt compelled to explain it. So we can see this elsewhere, guys. It's not just here in the Bible about something that sounds insane that maybe we even overlooked, because I definitely have overlooked it for many years. And I think only last year was this brought to my attention, and I was just like, wow, that's amazing. So then it mentions a curtain, and there's a note about that I'll read to you. But it's interesting that a lot of the disciples are not here while this is happening. Jesus' most painful time that he is going through for us, and none of his, well, I shouldn't say none of his disciples, but almost all these disciples are gone, right? They've lost hope. They thought they were wrong. He wasn't the Messiah, and they left him alone while he's going through all of this. And it says, like, at the end, like, you would think that most people are losing hope and they're turning away from him. They don't believe. But here we see in verse 47, the Roman officer overseeing the execution saw what happened. When he saw, he worshiped God and said, "Surely this man was innocent." People are still coming to God because of this death. Like, there is still a lot of transformation happening. The enemy did not win in this, even to the very end of this very awful moment. Lives are still being saved, and so he's praising God in all of this. And so it says at the end, but Jesus' friends, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. So that could be for a lot of different reasons. One, at least they were there, right? If you're thinking that it's bad that they weren't even close up, at least they were there. And the women, they had to be further out. And there's a note about this, and I think there's a note about this. I'll read it in a second. But they were still there. And so you have to remember that there's a ton of people that are also there. And they're just like, screaming for his death and still making fun of him and mocking him. So the note here, the significant event symbolized Christ's work on the cross. The temple had 3 parts. So this is the whole, like, the curtain of the temple verse. This is referring to that. The temple had 3 parts: the courts for all the people, the holy place where the holy priest could enter, and the most holy place where the high priest alone could enter once a year to atone for the sins of the people. It was in the most holy place that the Ark of the Covenant and God's presence with it rested. The curtain that was torn was the one that closed off the most holy place from view. At Christ's death, the barrier between God and humanity was split in 2. Now all people can approach God directly through Christ. Because of what Jesus did, because of him dying for us and all that bloodshed, he got rid of any barrier that was between us and God. That relationship with God was restored, and we were able to have our own personal and intimate relationship. We are able to have that now because of what Jesus did for us. They didn't have that before, right? If you have read the Old Testament, the kind of relationship that we have today with God, they did not have. We are so gifted and lucky to have the way that we do. So there's a chart here in my Bible about why did Jesus have to die, and it's worth reading. So the problem: we have all done things that are wrong, and we have failed to obey God's laws. Because of this, we have been separated from God, our Creator. Separation from God is death, but by ourselves, we can do nothing to become united with God. Why Jesus could help. Jesus was not only a man, he was God's unique son. Because Jesus never disobeyed God and never sinned, only he can bridge the gap between a sinless God and sinful people. The solution: Jesus freely offered his life for us, dying on the cross in our place, taking all our wrongdoing upon himself and saving us from the consequences of sin, including God's judgment and death. Jesus could have said no. He even asked to pass the cup, but more than that, he said, if this is what your will is, Father, then I'll go ahead and do it. So the results: Jesus took our past, present, and future sins upon himself so that we could have new life. Because all of our wrongdoing is forgiven, we are reconciled to God. Furthermore, Jesus' resurrection from the dead is the proof that his substitutionary sacrifice on the cross was acceptable to God, and his resurrection has become the source of new life for those who believe that Jesus is the Son of God. All who believe in him may have this new life and live it in union with him. Not through somebody else, not through a mediator, not through, some other physical prophet or a priest, for example. Like, we have that with him. We have that direct union with him now, all because of Jesus. Now we hear about Joseph, which is a member of the Jewish High Council, and he had already started coming around to Jesus at some point through all of this. He was not in agreement with the decision and the accusations of the other religious leaders. He was also from Judea, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God to come, because that's what the scriptures were pointing at. They had always been pointing to this. So with his heart changed, he went to Pilate and asked for Jesus's body. Then he took the body down from the cross and wrapped it on a long sheet of linen cloth and laid it in a new tomb that had been carved out of rock. He brought Jesus down, cared for him. One of the religious leaders from this group of people that had just spent so much time to get him arrested and crucified. This happened on late Friday afternoon, the day of preparation, as the Sabbath was about to begin. So his body was taken away. The women from Galilee followed and saw the tomb where his body was placed. Then they went home and prepared spices and ointments to anoint his body. But by the time they were finished, the Sabbath had begun, so they rested as required by the law. Those are the last 2 verses for this chapter. The note here says the Galilean women followed Joseph to the tomb, so they knew exactly where to find Jesus' body when they returned after the Sabbath with their spices and perfumes. These women could not do great things for Jesus. They were not permitted to stand up before the Jewish high council or the Roman governor and testify on his behalf, but they did what they could. They stayed at the cross when most of the disciples had left, and they got ready to anoint their Lord's body. Luke is pointing out the women again. When most people just left, most of Jesus's friends left, the women did whatever was in their power to show up as best as they could, even though they didn't understand what was actually happening. This was still their Lord, and they were still so sure, and they were doing what they could do. They showed up with everything they had. All right, you guys, that was chapter 23. We have one more to go. I definitely urge you to read the other gospels and compare the accounts. Some of them have a little bit more details than the other. Some will add just more context to some of the passages that are already here. And anyway, it's good. So yeah, I'm Denise with Misfit of Creation. I hope you've been enjoying these videos. I got one more left to go. I'd love to hear your notes, your thoughts, comments, whatever, put them down below. Be sure to check out my Etsy shop. I have a ton of Bible studies, devotionals, study charts. I actually have a comparison of all the gospels in there for what's the difference in them and who the audience is and things like that. I made a mention about identity on, and when I was talking about pride and humility, I have an identity Bible study in that shop too, by the way. That can be really helpful if that's something you've been struggling with. And I'm also happy to take any requests for things that have been on your mind that you want to dig deeper on. Making Bible studies is something that I started doing in jail ministry, and it's something that I keep doing. So if there's something that's been on your heart that you'd like to dig into more, let me know. I'm happy to work on something. I also have a podcast with a girlfriend of mine. It's called Prodigal Peas in a Pod. We have a new episode that comes out every Tuesday, and you can find us on every single podcast streaming platform. Again, Prodigal Peas in a Pod. And this is my ministry, Misfit of Creation. If you would like to be a supporter, I would definitely appreciate that. You can find me on Patreon, and I'll drop the handle down below. And link in the show notes, actually, or the video notes. So, all right, you guys, one more to go. I'll see you for that.